Right. So the second video we're going to have for today, we've talked about so far is the development of um, environmentalism, the development of professionalism, and the development of politics during the progressive era. But we're now going to focus a little bit on the developments in racial equality during this era. And this is one of the areas that stands out in stark contrast with a lot of the other progress of the progressive era, in that there was very little progress going on, at least from sort of a governmental standpoint, in what we now think of as the progressive era. But there were some very important sort of discussions and philosophical debates happening in the African American community about how they, as a community, should uh, advocate for themselves in order to try and gain equality that they weren't gaining otherwise. So we're going to kick this off beginning with probably one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in the history of the United States. Not the worst. I think it's probably Dred Scott. But this is probably a pretty solid like number two there, and is famously the Supreme Court case that later very famous Brown versus Board of Education overturns. And that is the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which establishes the separate but equal doctrine. A little bit of background on this. Homer Plessy is a gentleman that lives in New Orleans in the 1890s, and he is riding on one of the public train cars in like the little public sort of trolleys that I think are still go around New Orleans. Actually, Gus, you've lived there, you can probably attest to that. But on those public little trams that are around, and it is a time when there is a segregated public transportation service. So there's a whites only car, and the terminology at the time, a colored person's only car, a persons of color only car. And so um, Homer Plessy is a gentleman who I believe is 1/8 African American. His ancestry was 7/8 various versions of what we consider to be white or Caucasian, and 1/8 was African American. And according to law at the time, that was enough for him to be considered to be a person of color for segregation purposes. And so he wants to ride in the whites only car and is asked and compelled by the train conductor to leave the whites only car and go to the segregated car, and he refuses and is, I believe, given some sort of fine or something like that. And so he contests the fine and says that the idea of segregated public facilities is illegal and is unconstitutional based upon the 14th Amendment's equal protection clause, that all people should have equal protection, be guaranteed equal protection of the law. And so files suit, and it makes its way to the Supreme Court. And in 1896, the Supreme Court, which is pretty darn racist at the time, doesn't want to overturn this, and I believe by it is a 7-2 or 8-1 majority opinion, enshrines the doctrine of separate but equal. That you do not violate the equal protection clause if you have segregated facilities, public facilities, facilities run by, operated by, funded by government, as long as those facilities are equal. So you can have a train car for blacks and a train car for whites. You can have a school for students of color and a school for students that are Caucasian. You can have a swimming pool for African Americans and a swimming pool for white kids. As long as those facilities are equal, that is okay. And it is this Supreme Court decision that basically gives a legal thumbs up to the next 60 or so years of what we call segregation in the South, of legalized public facility segregation in the South. Um, and so the question is, how does kind of the African American community respond to this? One of the ways, and sort of famously, we still see a lot today, is one of the ways that the African American community begins to respond to this, and even state governments, for that matter, begin to respond to this, is the creation of schools and facilities for African Americans. They're like, well, if we have one facility and if we want to segregate it, we have to have an quote unquote equal facility for African American folks. So and particularly in the concept of schools, you still see this today in what are called HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities. At this time, there might have been in Alabama, Mississippi, for example, there's University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, University of Mississippi in Oxford, University of Georgia in Athens, stuff like that, right? Well, if the Supreme Court says now you either have to accept African Americans or you have to have an equal facility for African Americans. And so it is this time that you begin to see the creation of a lot of state-run schools specifically for African Americans. And so one of the first early ones is actually Hampton Institute, which actually starts as a private institute in Hampton Roads, Virginia. But you begin to see a lot of these popping up. And so a lot of schools in the South that are still around today, some public, some private. You've got like Moorhead, you've got Grambling, Southern University, Alabama State, North Carolina A&T. A lot of these schools are all popping up around the late 1800s, early 1900s, specifically in response to Plessy versus Ferguson. Um, and so, but this is you begin to see a lot of separation of public facilities at this time. Couple other sort of big overall things you're seeing. One, unfortunately, this time here in like right around the 19, I guess the aughts, so like, the 1900s, um, into maybe the early 19 teens, but like the 1900s in particular, is when you are seeing the height of the practice, the very unfortunate and just abhorrent practice of lynching happening in the United States and specifically in the South. And what this was basically a means for racist white Southern majorities who want to control and instill fear in the African American population so that they don't try and demand rights, so they don't try and demand equality, is to, if there is the potential, there is, someone is accused of a crime of some sort, that basically it is, public mob executions without any form of actual organized justice, and off, very, no protections at all, oftentimes false charges, simply to instill fear in the community, to not speak up, to not speak out for fear that you will be targeted and have a similar fate happen to you. And unfortunately, it is during this time that you see as many as, I think, somewhere around like 1904, 1905, you saw documented over like 50 or even close to 60 public lynchings or functionally public executions of African Americans each year during this time, largely as a form of like political social control of the African American population, as a means to just instill fear um, and to try and maintain the existing white power structure. Um, we'll talk about a little bit somebody who spends a lot of their time focusing on this, sort of brings this to attention and helps actually reduce this practice a little bit later. The third thing you're seeing, though, is how the sort of approach for African Americans of rights of progress. One would think there's a lot of progress in a lot of other areas for the poor, for those that are politically disempowered, immigrants, the impoverished, people in cities, all kinds of stuff. The progressive era sees a lot of progress, hence the name, in those areas, in social welfare, rights, democracy, all that kind of stuff. Unusually and abnormally, though, you see that there is very little progress in terms of racial equality in the country. In fact, there are probably many steps backwards during this time, which makes it kind of the anomaly in terms of the progressive era. And the question for the African American community at the time is like, wait a minute, we had some really good stuff happening like during Reconstruction when like the government was basically protecting our rights in the South. That went away. Then we, had some real problems in the 1880s, 1890s, and now we're actually seeing maybe some backsliding. Literally, the Supreme Court has said, yeah, we could be segregated, right? And that it's okay to do that as long as it's quote unquote equal. And we're having all kinds of social problems with the like lynchings and things like that. So the question at this point is, there's a discussion going on in the African American community writ large of how should we respond to this? As a community, they're saying we think we should have equal rights. We think we have equal self-worth and equal value as anyone else in this country. What is the best way for us as a community, for us as a people, to go about achieving that goal in the face of these many obstacles, both social and political? And that brings us to two probably of the most famous African Americans at this time who are actively writing and speaking back and forth with each other, basically having a public conversation and public debate over a span of about 10 years or so, answering that exact question of how can and how should the African American community respond to this lack of progress during an era that otherwise has progress for a lot of others. And the first of those individuals is a gentleman by the name of Booker T. Washington, who probably around like 1900, 1902 is, I think, arguably the most famous African American person in the United States, right? Um, Little background on him. He actually had started out as he was born as a slave in rural Virginia just before the Civil War. I think actually during the Civil War, if memory serves, um, and was born a slave. Obviously, Emancipation Proclamation comes around, Civil War ends, and but Virginia is Southern, still very segregated. He ends up, by the benefit of a benefactor, getting a little bit of money and being able to go and be educated at a new institution. That is being put in place for new institution put in place for African Americans that is now today Hampton University, the Hampton Pirates, if anybody's like an NCAA sports fan, in Virginia. And he actually while he is there getting his education. I believe he's getting like an education in like mechanical engineering, if memory serves. He like works as a custodian or a janitor to sort of like earn his way, kind of stuff, sort of working to pay his way through, and ends up becoming an educator. Believes strongly in the idea of the benefits, the economic benefits of manufacturing, of building, of using one's hands, and ends up becoming an educator of these like agricultural and mechanical approaches because he sees that these are skill sets that a lot of the former enslaved persons in the South have a monopoly on. You know, if you were the farmers, you were the ones that were repairing farm equipment and stuff like that on the old plantations, you are still the ones with those knowledge bases. And so we want to try and so that is something that we as an African American community have kind of a monopoly on in this area. So we want to try and teach that more and use that as a way to sort of develop ourselves academically. And so he becomes a teacher and he helps to found an institute called the Tuskegee School in Alabama to serve this exact purpose, to try and teach African Americans these skills that they can develop economically and that kind of stuff. And he ends up writing several books, several articles, and gives one of the most famous speeches, which is entitled The Atlanta Compromise at a major convention in Atlanta. I believe it is in 1905, if memory serves. Um, Arguing that the way for the African American community to best achieve long-term equality in the United States is not to like actively protest and demand rights and like get in the face of the white majority. That instead of that his basic argument is like you can't appeal to the decency and logic of like the racist, virulent white majority. That is just not an effective approach. And that instead, the best way to achieve equality is through economic development. That the African American community would need to demonstrate, to develop itself economically so that it didn't have to rely on the white community for its existence. And in doing so, could essentially prove to the white community that it was of equal, if not greater value, because they demonstrated themselves economically. And so his approach was we want to try and teach skills that we think will develop the African American community most effectively. And that's why he does a lot of, again, that focus on sort of agricultural, mechanical, hands-on construction kind of stuff, because again, that's what a lot of the African American, the former enslaved community had kind of a monopoly on those skills in the 1880s and 1890s because they were the ones that had done that during the Civil War and beforehand in the South, and sort of advocates kind of almost a sort of small s separation of the African American community into your own sort of enclaves, your own communities, work in amongst yourselves, develop yourselves economically over a generation or two, and then you'll be able to kind of demonstrate and prove to the majority racist white community that you have equal worth because he basically believes in the power of the almighty dollar. That is the best way to sort of achieve equality. It's not to like demand rights and hope that you create some sort of powerful, persuasive political argument, but it's just like through sheer economic force you can instill equality. And he becomes very famous for this, and is a very much a large advocate of those like what we now consider HBCUs, of one of the foremost educators of African Americans during this time period, and is very, very famous for sort of his approaches. We're going to show a short little video on him here. All right.
Without question,
I don't know
Booker T.
why this is the second
Washington
time I'm
was
trying to
the
run through
single
this.
most
For whatever reason, the
well-known
video is
African
not working.
American
We'll
of
put
his
up a link to
time,
the
may
to
have
this
been the
video
most celebrated black.
um, on the classroom page. I would suggest pausing, going and watching it. It's only like 2 or 3 minutes. So yeah, so we'll go to the next person here. The next person that Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington's still famous, is you'll see a lot of actually the public high schools that were created in response to Plessy versus Ferguson for the African American community. You'll see a lot of those, especially founded in like 1910, 1920, places like that. There's a lot of Booker T. Washington high schools out there. If anybody has seen Remember the Titans with Denzel Washington, right? The school that is based on is Booker T. Washington High School in Arlington, Virginia, right? It was the predominantly African American high school during the segregation era in the Virginia side of the Washington D.C. And so you see a lot of Booker T. Washington high schools around because a lot of those were named in like the 19 teens when Washington was probably the most famous African American person in the country, and so an advocate of education for African Americans. And so it made sense to like put his name on a lot of schools. The person he was having a public debate with, though, was a gentleman by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, who is just an amazingly brilliant person. Unlike Washington, Washington was born in the South as a slave in Virginia. W.E.B. Du Bois and had to like work his way up, and had to like work his way up through like manual jobs and stuff like that, right? W.E. Du Bois, on the other hand, very different background. He was born, I believe, in Massachusetts, in Boston, and he was educated at some of the best schools. He ended up attending Harvard and was actually the first PhD Harvard ever awarded to an African American. And was a prolific writer. He actually, if anybody is interested, he is essentially one of the founders of the modern field of sociology. One of the first sociologists. He actually did some really interesting work on like disease vectors in amongst the African American community in Philadelphia, if memory serves. Um, and his approach to like he comes from a very intellectual background, very different from Booker T. Washington, who comes from this sort of manual labor, pull yourself up by your bootstraps background, right? And so what W.E.B. Du Bois does is he essentially takes the other approach, is like we intellectually have the exact same abilities, rights, worth as human beings as anyone else, and we simply should demand, like these rights right now. And is comes from that sort of that ideological approach. He very famously writes a book called Souls of Black Folk, where he talks about the talented tenth. And his argument is that, like, there is a like there's like a 1/10 of the African American population that is like just as if not more brilliant than anyone else. And they, in and of themselves, if we can focus on them, educate them at the best schools, things like that, that they can kind of like lead our community into the future. So again, he went to an elite institution. His idea is elite institutional education for that talented subset of the population that really can benefit from it, can create kind of the leadership that we want, and advocate for us as a people, right? Um, and so his approach, he has some sort of like public debates with not like necessarily public debates, but like back and forth writings in public with Booker T. Washington of like, should we be demanding rights? Is that the way to most effectively have the African American community gain equality? Or is it through this like long-term economic building? Because those do kind of are opposite of each other. Like Du Bois, his talented tenth is like they should be learning the classics and they should be, doing all the things that you do at high level universities. Whereas Booker T. Washington is like we should be teaching our students how to farm, how to be blacksmiths, how to fix machinery and do stuff like that because that's where the true economic power of our community lies. And so it's very different approaches to it. And Du Bois ends up also famously being one of the founders of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, which is the predominant African American rights organization in the United States for the last century or so. It's actually the organization that helped fund a lot of the civil rights movement. It's the organization that funded Thurgood Marshall when he won the Brown versus Board of Education case. And so Du Bois becomes this very active voice in the African American community. Let's see if this video works. I think it does. Nope.
PhD from
I don't know why the sound isn't working. I'll fix it.
Du Bois
But yeah,
produced
I
a
will
number
post
of
this one as
academic
well. I
works,
will go watch it. It's in a
including the
little short, like
Philadelphia
3-minute thing, kind of
Negro
give you
in
some background on him.
1899,
So,
the first case study of
and so the third person we're going to talk about, and by the way, before we get there, like there is not a correct answer to this debate that Du Bois and Washington are having. One is very idealistic, but the question is it practical at all? Especially in like 1900, 1905, when there are high levels of segregation. There's literally like public executions and lynchings of people in the South. Like it's great to think that, elite, studying Greek and Latin will teach you how to think, but will that actually translate to results? That's one side versus Booker T. Washington. The problems of that are like, well, you're just saying, we should just like kind of give up, not fight, and just hope that somehow we like earn the respect of white people that hung around. Like, there's not a correct answer to either of these, but this is the debate that is happening in the African American community at this time, and a debate on sort of like a really important debate on how should the African American community be educated. Of is this what types of things should we be teaching in schools, even at these new schools that are being created? That's a fundamental question that is being asked. Yeah, that's part of why actually the Booker T. Washington approach. That's why you see a lot of HBCUs or something like A&M or A&T. North Carolina A&T, North Carolina Agricultural and Technical School. It's teaching those kind of manual labor skills. There's Alabama A&M, agricultural and mechanical. These are the types of things that they were wanting to teach because they thought that these are the things that had the most economic value. Similarly, Du Bois is sort of pushing for this like classical education, sort of integration into high-level institutions, right? Yeah. So, but Ida B. Wells is the third person we're going to talk about here and focus on. She uniquely is a journalist who shines a light on the practices of lynching that is happening in the South. Her entire life is dedicated to the idea of trying to expose this. Like this was kind of a quiet, dirty secret in the country that we didn't want to acknowledge. And she would report on it. She would photograph it. She would write about it. She tried to bring as much public attention to this horrific an abominable practice to try and discourage it from occurring. And ended up writing a book called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All of Its Phases, essentially an expose, and ends up becoming very successful in this, is probably the foremost person that we look to now to document this awful period in American history. And for her work, she actually was posthumously, after she had passed away, was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for her work. I'm going to want you to watch this, but I'm going to guess if I click on it, it's not going to work again. Yeah, I don't know why the sound's not working. I'll fix it for next one. But I will post this little short video as well, sort of talking about her.
Wells
So I want
became
you,
a
before
leader
you
in
answer the
anti-lynching.
questions, before you answer the question, I'm going to want you to watch those 3 short videos: the one on Booker T, the one on Du Bois, and the one on Ida B. Wells. They're 3 or 4 minutes each. And once you do those, we're going to go to the 5th question and have you write that here. Is during the Progressive Era, lots of good things happened, right? All kinds of advancement, but very little advancement for African Americans. And certainly, like major leaders in power, presidents, were not exactly sticking their neck out to bring attention to this. And some of them were actively pushing against it, right? My question for you is, in an era of so much progress for all kinds of downtrodden, marginalized populations in society, why do you, and there's not a right answer to this, but why do you think at this time African Americans were the ones that were uniquely like left out of this overall wave of progress? So many other groups, immigrants, women, who we're going to talk about in a minute, all kinds of people had massive steps forward. African Americans kind of uniquely did not share in those positive steps forward, at least from a governmental perspective. Why do you think that was the case? Go ahead and write that question now. Write that answer now.